When King John of England died in 1216, he left behind a divided realm and a scattered family. Some of his children would go on to wear crowns. Others would vanish into the footnotes of history. A queen in Scotland, an empress in Italy, a rebel countess who helped bring down her own brother, and a daughter who married a Welsh prince and nearly united two warring nations. John's legacy lived on through his bloodline, but not in the ways anyone could have predicted. His eldest son would become one of England's longest reigning kings. His daughter would defy him from beyond the grave by marrying his greatest enemy. Another would rule as empress across the Alps, while one more would die childless in a Scottish castle, her diplomatic marriage yielding nothing but sorrow. In this episode, we follow every one of them, the heirs and the forgotten, to discover how the bloodline of England's most controversial king carried on and where it ended. On October 1st, 1207, at Winchester Castle, Isabella of England gave birth to a son. The boy they named Henry would inherit a throne at 9 years old and hold it for 56 years, longer than any English monarch before him. His birth represented hope for John's troubled reign, providing the Angevin dynasty with its crucial male heir. The timing proved prophetic. Henry entered the world as his father's conflicts with the barons intensified, his disputes with the church deepened, and his continental territories slipped away. This infant prince would inherit not a stable kingdom, but the fragments of one. Young Henry spent his earliest years moving between royal castles as civil war engulfed England. When John died at Newark in October 1216, the boy found himself king at an age when most children still learned their letters. The regency fell to William Marshal, Earl of Pembroke, one of the most respected knights in Christendom, and Hubert de Burgh, the justiciar who had defended Dover Castle against French invasion. These men shaped Henry's education and kingship during England's darkest hour. French forces occupied London. Scottish armies pressed south. Welsh princes raided the borders. The new king's supporters controlled perhaps a third of England. Marshal and de Burgh taught Henry that royal authority came not from birth alone, but from earning the loyalty of subjects who had viable alternatives. The young king learned statecraft through necessity. His coronation at Gloucester Abbey on October 28th, using his mother's simple gold circlet because the crown jewels remained in rebel hands, demonstrated both the fragility and resilience of monarchical power. Henry watched as his guardians negotiated, compromised, and gradually restored royal authority through patience rather than force. Henry's personal rule began in earnest around 1227, when he declared his majority and dismissed Hubert de Burgh. The kingdom he inherited was fundamentally different from his father's. John's losses of Normandy, Anjou, and Poitou had transformed England from a continental empire's subsidiary into an island kingdom that looked inward for the first time in centuries. This transformation shaped Henry's reign. Where John had been peripatetic, moving constantly between England and France, Henry remained largely in England, developing a settled court culture centered on Westminster. Where John had ruled through intimidation and sudden violence, Henry governed through elaborate ceremony and bureaucratic procedure. The son consciously rejected the father's methods. Henry's great passion was architecture and the arts. He spent enormous sums rebuilding Westminster Abbey in the latest Gothic style, creating a royal mausoleum to rival Saint Denis or Reims. His court attracted scholars, poets, and craftsmen from across Europe. He patronized the emerging mendicant orders and founded new religious houses. These expenditures reflected not mere vanity, but a deliberate strategy to present monarchy as divinely ordained and culturally sophisticated. Yet this same cultural sophistication created political problems. Henry's preference for Poitevin and Provençal advisors, relatives of his wife Eleanor of Provence, alienated English barons who had grown accustomed to greater influence during the Regency period. His attempts to recover his father's French territories through expensive but unsuccessful campaigns drained the royal treasury and required constant parliamentary grants. The crisis came in the 1250s and 1260s. Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, Henry's brother-in-law and former friend, emerged as leader of baronial opposition. The provisions of Oxford in 1258 imposed constitutional limitations on royal power unprecedented since Magna Carta. Henry's rejection of these provisions led to civil war. The Second Barons' War tested everything Henry had learned about kingship. At Lewes in May 1264, de Montfort's forces captured Henry and his eldest son Edward, placing the monarchy under baronial control. For 15 months, Henry ruled as a puppet while de Montfort governed England in his name. Only Edward's escape and victory at Evesham in August 1265, where de Montfort died in battle, restored royal authority. Henry married Eleanor of Provence in January 1236 at Canterbury Cathedral. This alliance brought England into the complex web of Mediterranean politics centered on Eleanor's uncle, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II. Eleanor proved an intelligent and capable queen, but her large contingent of Provençal relatives created lasting resentment among English nobles. The marriage produced 4 children who would reshape European politics. Edward, born in 1239, became one of the most formidable warrior kings of the Middle Ages. Margaret married Alexander III of Scotland in 1251, cementing peace between the kingdoms. Beatrice married John II of Brittany, extending English influence into France. Edmund received the Kingdom of Sicily from the Pope, though he never ruled there effectively. Henry's relationship with his children reflected his complex personality. He was an affectionate father, but also a demanding king who expected his offspring to serve dynastic interests. His conflicts with Edward during the Barons' War tested this balance, but father and son ultimately reconciled when they recognized their mutual dependence. Henry spent his entire reign managing his father's reputation and consequences. John's loss of Normandy forced Henry to develop England as an independent kingdom rather than a continental appendage. John's conflicts with the church required Henry to demonstrate ostentatious piety. John's constitutional disputes with the barons necessitated Henry's careful attention to parliamentary procedure and legal precedent. Yet Henry also inherited his father's determination and political instincts. When threatened, he could be as ruthless as John. His suppression of baronial revolt after Evesham was thorough and effective. His expansion of royal administration continued John's work of building centralized government. His patronage of learning and arts reflected John's own interests in intellectual and cultural matters. Henry died at Westminster on November 16, 1272, after 56 years on the throne. His reign had transformed England from a war-torn island into a prosperous kingdom with settled institutions and clear constitutional procedures. The dynasty John had nearly destroyed was now secure. Edward I inherited a stable realm, a full treasury, and international respect. Henry's greatest achievement was ensuring that the Plantagenet line continued not through conquest, but through successful governance. The child king who had inherited civil war bequeathed his son the strongest monarchy in Western Europe. With Henry's death, the crown passed unbroken to a new generation that would dominate European politics for centuries. Richard was born on January 5, 1209, at Winchester Castle, making him King John's second legitimate son. His birth secured the succession with a spare heir, following medieval royal practice. Named for his uncle, the lion-hearted Crusader king, Richard entered the world as a valuable diplomatic asset in an age when royal brothers commanded kingdoms, duchies, or at minimum, substantial earldoms. John granted his second son the earldom of Cornwall in 1225, recognizing the 16-year-old's coming of age. Cornwall brought vast tin mining revenues, making Richard one of the wealthiest magnates in Europe. This financial foundation would define his entire career. Richard grew up in his brother's shadow, but received an education befitting a royal prince. Like Henry, he learned statecraft during the civil wars of John's final years, but without the burden of kingship. This freedom allowed him to develop interests in commerce, finance, and continental politics that Henry, focused on domestic governance, could never pursue. The brothers maintained a complex relationship throughout their lives. Richard served as Henry's most trusted lieutenant in military campaigns and diplomatic missions, yet also emerged as his most effective critic during constitutional crises. Where Henry was artistic and ceremonial, Richard was practical and calculating. Where Henry inspired loyalty through personal charisma, Richard commanded respect through demonstrated competence. Richard's career divided into three distinct phases: English magnate, Crusader, and German king. Each demonstrated different aspects of his remarkable abilities. As Earl of Cornwall, Richard revolutionized English mining operations, introducing new techniques and expanding production. His tin monopoly generated revenues rivaling those of entire kingdoms. He invested these profits in land acquisition, money lending, and commercial ventures across Western Europe. By 1240, Richard was arguably the richest private individual in Christendom. This wealth enabled his crusading expedition of 1240 to 1242. Unlike most crusaders, who bankrupted themselves financing their expeditions, Richard arrived in the Holy Land with sufficient resources to negotiate effectively with both Christian and Muslim leaders. His diplomatic agreements with the Ayyubid Sultan allowed peaceful Christian pilgrimage to Jerusalem for the first time in decades. Military historians consider his bloodless achievement more valuable than the conquests of earlier crusades. Richard's greatest opportunity came in 1256 when German princes elected him King of the Romans, heir to the Holy Roman Empire. This honor reflected both his financial resources and his reputation for diplomatic skill. However, his rival Alfonso X of Castile also claimed the throne, creating a disputed succession that lasted for decades. Richard's German kingship proved more symbolic than substantial. He made 4 expeditions across the Alps but never established effective control over imperial territories. German princes accepted his money but not his authority. He was crowned at Aachen in May 1257, but his realm remained limited to the Rhineland cities that benefited from his commercial investments. The contradiction at the heart of Richard's career was that his greatest strength, vast financial resources, could not purchase the one thing he most desired: lasting political authority. He could buy temporary alliances but not permanent loyalty. He could fund expeditions but not create institutions. His reign as King of the Romans became an expensive exercise in frustrated ambition. Richard married 3 times, each alliance reflecting different phases of his career. His first wife, Isabella Marshal, daughter of the regent who had saved Henry's throne, cemented Richard's position within the English nobility. Their marriage in 1231 produced 4 children, including Henry of Almaine, who inherited Richard's wealth and political ambitions. After Isabella's death in 1240, Richard married Sanchia of Provence in 1243, sister to Henry's queen Eleanor. This marriage strengthened the brothers' alliance and enhanced Richard's continental connections. Sanchia bore no surviving children, leaving Henry of Almaine as Richard's heir. Richard's third marriage in 1269 to Beatrice of Falkenberg, a German noblewoman, reflected his ongoing commitment to imperial politics. Beatrice was 30 years younger than Richard and survived him by many years, though their marriage produced only one child, Edmund of Cornwall, born when Richard was past 60. These marriages demonstrated Richard's strategic thinking, but also his ultimate failure to establish a lasting dynasty. Unlike his brother Henry, whose children founded royal lines across Europe, Richard's offspring inherited wealth but not power. Richard inherited his father's intelligence and ambition, but channeled these traits more successfully than John ever managed. Where John antagonized his subjects through erratic behavior, Richard maintained consistent policies that served his interests while respecting others' rights. Where John's financial expedience alienated his supporters, Richard's business acumen created mutually beneficial relationships. Yet Richard also shared John's fundamental limitation: the inability to inspire deep personal loyalty. Both men commanded respect through competence rather than affection through character. Richard's subjects obeyed him because he paid them, not because they loved him. Richard died at Berkhamsted Castle on April 2, 1272, just months before his brother Henry. His German kingdom died with him, as no successor could match his financial resources or diplomatic connections. Henry of Allemagne had predeceased his father, murdered by his cousins during a family feud in Italy. Edmund of Cornwall inherited vast estates but no political authority. The richest man in Europe left behind impressive monuments, rebuilt castles, endowed monasteries, and expanded commercial networks. His tomb at Hales Abbey, which he had founded and magnificently endowed, remained a pilgrimage destination for centuries. Yet his political achievements vanished within a generation. Richard of Cornwall proved that in medieval politics, money alone could not purchase lasting power. His career illuminated both the possibilities and limitations of royal brothers who sought to carve out independent spheres of influence. With his death, the last attempt to restore English influence in imperial Germany ended in failure. Joan was born in 1210, the eldest daughter of King John and Isabella of England. Her birth provided the Angevin dynasty with a valuable diplomatic asset, as royal daughters in the 13th century served as living treaties between hostile kingdoms. From infancy, Joan's marriage prospects would be evaluated not for personal happiness, but for political advantage. As John's daughter, Joan inherited the complex legacy of Anglo-Scottish relations. Her grandfather, Henry II, had claimed overlordship of Scotland, leading to decades of intermittent warfare. Her father, John, had maintained this pressure, supporting English claimants to the Scottish throne and raiding across the borders. Joan's marriage would either perpetuate this conflict or offer an opportunity for peace. Joan spent her childhood moving between royal castles as her father's reign descended into chaos. Unlike her brothers, who received military training and political education, Joan learned the domestic arts expected of a medieval queen: household management, religious observance, and the subtle diplomacy required to maintain harmony in a foreign court. Her education emphasized languages, as medieval queens needed to communicate with subjects who might speak different tongues. Joan mastered Norman French, the language of aristocracy across both England and Scotland, as well as enough Latin for religious services and enough English for dealing with common subjects. The Scots court. Joan would eventually join differed significantly from the English royal household. Scotland remained more traditionally Celtic in culture, with clan loyalties competing against royal authority. Scottish queens wielded less formal power than their English counterparts but exercised greater personal influence through kinship networks and religious patronage. Joan's career was defined by a single diplomatic mission: cementing peace between England and Scotland through her marriage to Alexander II. This alliance was negotiated in 1220 when Joan was 10 years old, reflecting the medieval practice of arranging royal marriages long before consummation. The wedding took place at York Minster on June 19, 1221, with immense ceremony designed to demonstrate the importance both kingdoms placed on this alliance. Joan was 11 years old, Alexander 23. Such age differences were common in royal marriages, though consummation was typically delayed until the bride reached physical maturity. As Queen of Scotland, Joan faced the challenge of maintaining loyalty to both her birth family and her adopted realm. When Henry III and Alexander II disputed border territories, Joan found herself caught between competing allegiances. She successfully mediated several minor conflicts, demonstrating the diplomatic skills that made royal marriage alliances valuable. Joan's court became a center of cultural exchange between English and Scottish traditions. She patronized both English and Scottish religious houses, founded hospitals for the poor, and supported educational institutions. Her household included attendants from both kingdoms, creating an environment where previously hostile nobles learned to cooperate. However, Joan's most important role remained unfulfilled. Medieval queens were expected to produce male heirs to secure dynastic succession. Joan's failure to bear children created increasing tension as Alexander's reign progressed. Without a direct heir, the Scottish throne would pass to collateral relatives, potentially destabilizing the kingdom. Joan's marriage to Alexander II illustrated both the possibilities and limitations of diplomatic unions. The couple appeared to develop genuine affection, with contemporary chroniclers noting their frequent joint appearances at religious ceremonies and their shared interest in charitable works. Alexander treated his English queen with respect and included her in political discussions. Yet the marriage's political success depended entirely on producing an heir. Medieval medicine offered little understanding of infertility, often blaming the woman when couples failed to conceive. Joan underwent various treatments recommended by physicians and sought intercession from numerous saints, but no pregnancy resulted. The couple's childlessness created a succession crisis that threatened to undermine their alliance. Scottish nobles began pressing Alexander to seek an annulment, arguing that the kingdom's security required a fertile queen. English nobles worried that Scottish independence from papal authority might facilitate divorce proceedings that would humiliate Joan and destroy the peace treaty. Joan's personal response to this pressure demonstrated considerable dignity. Rather than competing with potential rivals or pressing her husband for unrealistic guarantees, she encouraged Alexander to consider remarriage while negotiating terms that would preserve her status and security. This practical approach reflected both political wisdom and personal maturity. Joan never knew her father as an adult, since John died when she was 6 years old. However, her Scottish marriage represented the fulfillment of John's diplomatic vision. Where John had failed to subdue Scotland through military force, his daughter achieved through peaceful means the stable borders and reduced conflict that had eluded him. Joan's queenship also demonstrated successful resolution of the religious conflicts that had dominated John's reign. Where John had fought bitter disputes with the church over appointments and jurisdiction, Joan enjoyed excellent relations with both English and Scottish ecclesiastical authorities. Her pious reputation and generous patronage won clerical support that proved valuable during political crises. The marriage alliance lasted until Joan's death in March 1238 at Havering at Bower in Essex, where she had been visiting her brother Henry III. She was 28 years old and had been queen for 17 years. Her death ended one of the most successful diplomatic marriages of the 13th century, though its ultimate failure to produce heirs limited its long-term impact. Alexander II remarried within months of Joan's death, wedding Marie de Coucy, a French noblewoman who bore him the future Alexander III in 1241. This marriage continued the peaceful Anglo-Scottish relations Joan had established, suggesting that her diplomatic work had created lasting institutional changes that survived her personal departure. Joan was buried at Tarrant Crawford Abbey in Dorset, a Cistercian nunnery she had generously patronized. Her tomb became a site of pilgrimage, with visitors seeking intercession for marital harmony and diplomatic peace. The abbey preserved her memory as a queen who placed duty above personal desire and achieved honor through sacrifice. With Joan's death, the first diplomatic bridge between Plantagenet England and Stuart Scotland passed into history, but the precedent she established would influence royal marriage policy for generations. Isabella was born in 1214, making her King John's youngest legitimate daughter and one of his final children. Her birth came during the catastrophic period when John was losing his continental territories to Philip Augustus of France, fighting civil war against rebellious barons, and facing papal interdict over ecclesiastical appointments. In this context, Isabella represented hope for future diplomatic rehabilitation. Named for her mother, Isabella of Angoulême, the younger Isabella inherited the complex legacy of Anglo-continental relations. Her mother's family controlled strategically important territories in southwestern France, making Isabella a valuable asset for future alliances with European powers seeking to challenge French expansion. Isabella received the sophisticated education appropriate for a princess destined for marriage into the highest ranks of European nobility. She learned multiple languages including Latin, French, German, and Italian, anticipating potential marriage alliances across the continent. Her education emphasized diplomatic protocol, court etiquette, and the cultural refinements that would enable her to adapt to foreign environments. Unlike her sister Joan, whose education focused on the domestic arts expected of a queen, Isabella received training in the political arts required of an empress. She studied imperial history, legal principles, and the complex relationships between papal, imperial, and royal authorities that dominated 13th century politics. Isabella's childhood was spent at Henry III's court, where she observed her brother's struggles with baronial opposition and constitutional limitations. This experience taught her valuable lessons about the balance between royal authority and aristocratic privilege that would prove essential when she later entered imperial politics. Isabella's destiny was determined in 1235 when Henry III negotiated her marriage to Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor. This alliance represented England's most ambitious diplomatic initiative since John's loss of Normandy, seeking to restore English influence in continental politics through imperial connection. The marriage negotiations revealed the sophisticated diplomacy of which Henry's court was capable. Frederick II was the most powerful ruler in Europe, controlling Germany, Italy, and Sicily, while also claiming authority over the Holy Land as King of Jerusalem. His agreement to marry Isabella demonstrated recognition of England's renewed importance under Henry's rule. Isabella traveled to Italy for the wedding, which took place at Worms Cathedral on July 20, 1235. She was 21 years old, Frederick 41. The ceremony was attended by princes from across Europe and represented a diplomatic triumph for the Plantagenet dynasty. As Holy Roman Empress, Isabella found herself at the center of the most complex political situation in medieval Europe. Frederick's conflicts with Pope Gregory IX over imperial authority in Italy required careful diplomatic balancing. Isabella's role was to maintain English support for imperial policies while avoiding actions that would damage Henry III's relations with the Church. Isabella proved adept at this challenging position. She established cordial relations with imperial nobles while maintaining correspondence with English barons and prelates. Her court became a center for cultural exchange between English, German, and Italian traditions, with scholars and artists traveling between London, Palermo, and the imperial capitals. However, Isabella's imperial career was tragically brief. Medieval medicine had little understanding of pregnancy complications, and royal women faced particular risks from court physicians who attempted dangerous interventions. Isabella died in childbirth in December 1241 at Foggia in southern Italy, after only 6 years of marriage. Isabella's marriage to Frederick II was one of the most politically significant unions of the 13th century. Frederick was renowned as Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world, for his intellectual achievements, diplomatic skill, and military prowess. His court in Sicily was the most sophisticated in Europe, attracting scholars, poets, and scientists from across the Mediterranean world. The couple appeared to develop genuine affection despite the political nature of their union. Frederick included Isabella in imperial ceremonies and consulted her on matters affecting English interests. Isabella adapted successfully to the multicultural environment of the imperial court, where Greek, Arab, Latin, and vernacular traditions coexisted. Isabella's pregnancy in 1241 was celebrated throughout the empire as promising continuation of the Hohenstaufen dynasty. Frederick's previous marriages had produced sons, but Isabella's child would represent the union of imperial and Plantagenet bloodlines. Unfortunately, both mother and child died during delivery, ending these dynastic hopes. The loss devastated Frederick, who had grown genuinely attached to his English wife. He honored Isabella's memory by founding a monastery at the site of her death and endowing masses for her soul. Her death marked a turning point in Frederick's reign, after which his conflicts with the Church intensified and his imperial authority began to decline. Isabella never knew her father personally, as John died when she was 2 years old. However, her imperial marriage represented vindication of John's continental ambitions. Where John had failed to maintain English territories in France through military force, Isabella achieved through diplomatic means a position of influence in European politics. Isabella's brief but spectacular career demonstrated the possibilities available to medieval royal women who combined intelligence with opportunity. As Empress, she wielded more political authority than most queens, participating in imperial assemblies and influencing policy decisions that affected millions of subjects across Europe. Her death ended England's direct connection to imperial politics for centuries. Frederick II never remarried, and his later conflicts with the Pope and German nobles led to the collapse of Hohenstaufen power after his death in 1250. Isabella's imperial crown passed into history with her. Isabella was buried at Andria Cathedral in Apulia, where Frederick erected a magnificent tomb that survived until the cathedral's reconstruction in the 18th century. Contemporary chroniclers described her funeral as one of the most solemn ceremonies of Frederick's reign, attended by representatives from across Europe. The Empress, who might have united English and imperial bloodlines, became instead a symbol of the fragility of medieval diplomatic achievements. Her 6-year reign demonstrated both the heights medieval royal women could reach and the sudden reversals of fortune that could destroy the most carefully constructed alliances. With Isabella's death, the most ambitious Plantagenet diplomatic initiative of the 13th century ended in tragedy, but her example inspired future generations of royal women to seek active roles in European politics. Eleanor was born in 1215, making her King John's final legitimate child and the daughter who would prove most like her father in temperament and political instincts. Her birth occurred during the crisis year of Magna Carta and baronial revolt, when John's authority had collapsed across much of England. Eleanor inherited both the Plantagenet determination and the Angevin capacity for making enemies. As John's youngest child, Eleanor grew up in the shadow of older siblings who commanded greater attention and resources. This position taught her self-reliance and political calculation that would prove essential when she later challenged royal authority through her choice of husband. Eleanor received an education emphasizing the martial traditions of the Plantagenet family. Unlike her sisters Joan and Isabella, who were trained primarily for diplomatic marriages, Eleanor learned to appreciate military strategy, understand territorial politics, and evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of competing noble factions. Her upbringing at Henry III's court exposed her to the constitutional conflicts that dominated her brother's reign. Eleanor observed Henry's struggles with Simon de Montfort during the 1250s, when the Earl of Leicester emerged as leader of baronial opposition to royal policies. This experience gave Eleanor intimate knowledge of the political arguments that would later divide her family. Eleanor's education also emphasized religious devotion, though not the conventional piety expected of medieval royal women. She developed interests in Reformed monasticism and evangelical preaching that aligned her with ecclesiastical reformers who often opposed royal policies. This religious commitment would provide ideological justification for her later political choices. Eleanor's first marriage in 1224 to William Marshal the Younger, Earl of Pembroke, represented conventional royal diplomacy. The Marshalls were the most prestigious military family in England, and this alliance strengthened Henry III's position during the early years of his personal rule. As Countess of Pembroke, Eleanor managed vast estates in Ireland and Wales while learning the practical skills required for territorial administration. William's death in 1231 left Eleanor a wealthy widow at 16 with no children and complete control over her inheritance. Medieval law granted widows significant autonomy, and Eleanor used this freedom to pursue interests that increasingly conflicted with royal policy. She became a patron of reformed religious houses and supported educational institutions that promoted clerical independence from royal control. Eleanor's political transformation began in the 1230s as she developed friendships with nobles who opposed Henry's policies. Her salon became a gathering place for critics of royal expenditure on continental adventures and ceremonial display. Eleanor's position as the king's sister gave weight to criticisms that might otherwise have been dismissed as treasonous. The crisis came in 1238, when Eleanor married Simon de Montfort, without seeking Henry's permission. This marriage violated both legal requirements for royal consent and political expectations for family loyalty. Henry reacted with fury, considering the match a personal betrayal and a challenge to royal authority. Eleanor's justification for this defiant marriage revealed sophisticated political thinking. She argued that her duty to God and conscience superseded her obligations to family and crown. This argument drew on emerging theories of natural law and individual conscience that would later influence constitutional development across Europe. As Countess of Leicester, Eleanor became the intellectual partner of England's most formidable political opposition leader. She participated in de Montfort's planning for constitutional reform, contributed to the theoretical justifications for limiting royal power, and helped organize the baronial coalition that would impose the provisions of Oxford on Henry III in 1258. Eleanor's marriage to Simon de Montfort was both a love match and a political alliance. Contemporary accounts describe genuine affection between the couple, but their union also represented the merger of complementary political skills. Eleanor brought insider knowledge of royal decision-making, while Simon contributed military leadership and baronial connections. The couple produced 6 children who would play significant roles in English politics. Henry de Montfort inherited his father's military abilities and political ambitions. Simon the Younger became a scholar and administrator who attempted to implement constitutional reforms. Guy and Amory de Montfort pursued continental careers, while Eleanor and Richard remained in England to continue family traditions. Eleanor's role in the baronial movement extended beyond symbolic support. She participated in planning sessions, contributed to propaganda efforts, and helped coordinate military strategy during the Second Barons' War. Her position as royal sister provided legitimacy for actions that might otherwise have been condemned as rebellion. The family's political career reached its climax during the period of baronial rule from 1264 to 1265, when Simon de Montfort effectively governed England in Henry's name. Eleanor served as unofficial queen during this period, presiding over court ceremonies and diplomatic receptions. Her royal blood provided constitutional cover for de Montfort's unprecedented exercise of power. Eleanor never knew her father personally, but she inherited John's political instincts and strategic intelligence. Like John, she possessed the ability to identify weaknesses in opponents' positions and exploit these vulnerabilities through careful timing and alliance building. Like John, she also demonstrated a willingness to challenge established authority when circumstances demanded bold action. However, Eleanor learned from John's mistakes in ways that her brothers did not. Where John had antagonized supporters through erratic behavior and broken promises, Eleanor maintained consistent principles and honored agreements. Where John had isolated himself through personal failures, Eleanor built lasting friendships based on shared ideological commitments. Eleanor's constitutional theories influenced political development for generations. Her arguments for limiting royal power through institutional checks and baronial participation provided intellectual foundations for parliamentary government. Her example of principled resistance to illegitimate authority inspired later generations of political reformers. The collapse of the baronial movement at Evesham in August 1265 ended Eleanor's political career, but not her influence. Simon de Montfort's death in battle made her a widow for the second time, now facing the vengeful fury of her nephew Edward and brother Henry. Eleanor fled to France with her surviving children, beginning a quarter-century of exile. Eleanor's final years were spent in religious retreat at Montargis Abbey, where she died in April 1275. Her last decade demonstrated the same principled commitment to conscience that had defined her political career. She refused offers of reconciliation that would have required repudiating her husband's constitutional ideals. Eleanor was buried at Montargis with ceremonies befitting a royal princess, though her tomb inscription emphasized her role as defender of constitutional liberty rather than her royal birth. French chroniclers praised her as a woman who chose principle over comfort and conscience over family loyalty. With Eleanor's death, the most intellectually sophisticated critic of Plantagenet absolutism passed into history, but her constitutional legacy would influence English political development for centuries. King John's acknowledged illegitimate children numbered at least 8, though medieval records suggest the actual total was higher. These royal bastards received recognition, financial support, and marriage alliances that reflected their father's political needs while illustrating the complex relationships between legitimate and illegitimate royal offspring in medieval society. Joan, born around 1191, was John's eldest acknowledged illegitimate daughter and his most politically important bastard child. Her mother's identity remains uncertain, though she was likely a noblewoman from John's early entourage. Joan's significance lay not in her birth, but in her marriage to Llywelyn ap Iorwerth, Prince of Gwynedd, around 1205. This marriage represented John's most successful attempt to pacify Wales through diplomacy rather than conquest. Llywelyn was emerging as the dominant Welsh prince, capable of uniting the fractured principalities against English expansion. Joan's marriage created a family alliance that secured England's western borders while providing Llywelyn with royal connections that enhanced his status among competing Welsh rulers. As Princess of Gwynedd, Joan navigated the complex loyalties required of a royal bastard married to her father's potential enemy. She maintained correspondence with the English court while adapting to Welsh culture and customs. Her bilingual household served as a diplomatic bridge between two traditionally hostile societies. Joan's marriage proved fruitful both personally and politically. She bore Llywelyn several children, including Dafydd ap Llywelyn, who inherited his father's principality and continued the alliance with England. The couple appeared to develop genuine affection despite the political nature of their union. However, Joan's position became increasingly difficult as John's relations with Llywelyn deteriorated. The English king's demands for military service conflicted with Welsh interests, forcing Joan to choose between birth family and adopted realm. She generally supported her husband's policies while working to prevent complete breakdown in Anglo-Welsh relations. Joan's most dramatic moment came in 1230, when she was discovered in an adulterous relationship with William de Braos, a powerful English lord whose family had been enemies of King John. Llywelyn's reaction was swift and brutal. He hanged de Braos immediately and imprisoned Joan for several months. The scandal threatened to destroy the Anglo-Welsh alliance her marriage had created. Yet Joan's political skills ultimately preserved both her marriage and the diplomatic relationship it represented. She convinced Llywelyn that her affair was personal rather than political, motivated by passion rather than treachery. Her public penance and private reconciliation with her husband restored stability to the alliance. Joan died in 1237 at Aber, one of Llywelyn's principal courts. She was buried at Llanfaes Priory, which Llywelyn founded in her memory. Her tomb became a pilgrimage site where visitors prayed for marital reconciliation and diplomatic peace. The priory preserved Joan's memory as a woman who successfully balanced competing loyalties through intelligence and determination. Richard Fitzroy, born around 1190, was John's eldest acknowledged illegitimate son and the bastard who most closely resembled his father in temperament and abilities. His mother was probably a minor noblewoman from John's household during the 1180s. Richard received military training appropriate for a royal bastard, learning the arts of war that might enable him to carve out an independent position in a world that offered illegitimate sons few inherited rights. Unlike Joan, whose marriage served immediate diplomatic purposes, Richard's career developed more gradually through military service and territorial acquisition. He participated in John's campaigns in Normandy and Poitou, demonstrating the martial skills that would define his later career. John rewarded this service with grants of land and revenues that provided financial independence. Richard's most significant opportunity came during the civil wars following John's death. He supported his legitimate half-brother Henry III against the barons who had opposed John's rule. This loyalty earned royal gratitude and additional territorial grants that established Richard as a substantial landowner in his own right. As a military commander, Richard proved competent but not exceptional. He successfully defended royal castles during baronial revolts and led expeditions against Welsh raiders, but never achieved the dramatic victories that might have elevated him to the highest ranks of the nobility. His career illustrated both the opportunities available to royal bastards and the limitations imposed by illegitimate birth. Richard married Rohisi de Dover, heiress to estates in Kent and the Channel Islands. This marriage, arranged with Henry III's approval, demonstrated royal acceptance of Richard's status while providing him with additional territorial base. The couple produced several children who inherited both paternal royal connections and maternal landed wealth. Richard died around 1246 after a career spanning 4 decades of military service. He was buried at Dover Priory, where his tomb inscription identified him as Richard, son of King John, faithful knight and loyal brother. His descendants established a minor gentry family that preserved royal connections for several generations. Oliver Fitzroy, Geoffrey Fitzroy, and John Fitzroy represent the forgotten illegitimate sons whose careers remain largely obscure in surviving records. These royal bastards receive sufficient recognition to appear in official documents, but insufficient importance to merit detailed chronicling by contemporary historians. Oliver appears to have followed a clerical career, receiving ecclesiastical benefices through royal patronage. Geoffrey may have died young, as his name disappears from records after the 1220s. John pursued a military career similar to Richard's, but apparently without notable success or substantial territorial rewards. These forgotten bastards illustrate the variable treatment illegitimate royal children could expect. Where Joan and Richard received substantial support that enabled successful independent careers, their half-brothers apparently received only minimal assistance. The difference reflected both personal capabilities and political circumstances that favored some royal bastards over others. John's illegitimate children demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations available to royal bastards in medieval society. Those who received substantial support could establish lasting positions through marriage alliances, military service, or territorial acquisition. Those who lacked such support often disappeared into historical obscurity. The successful bastards also illustrated important aspects of John's character and policies. His willingness to acknowledge and support illegitimate children revealed genuine paternal affection that contrasted with his reputation for political ruthlessness. His strategic use of bastard marriages showed diplomatic sophistication that achieved through personal relationships what military force had failed to accomplish. Most significantly, the bastards provided alternative sources of royal influence when legitimate succession faced challenges. Joan's Welsh marriage secured borders that military campaigns had failed to pacify. Richard's military service helped preserve Henry III's throne during constitutional crises. These contributions justified the resources John invested in supporting his illegitimate offspring. With the deaths of the last acknowledged bastards in the 1240s and 1250s, John's illegitimate line passed into the broader English nobility, carrying royal blood but not royal authority into future generations. When King John died at Newark Castle in October 1216, contemporary observers might reasonably have predicted the end of Angevin rule in England. The kingdom was torn by civil war, occupied by foreign armies, and governed by a child whose legitimacy many questioned. John's children faced the daunting task of rebuilding both royal authority and dynastic reputation from these unpromising foundations. Yet the collective achievement of John's offspring exceeded even the most optimistic contemporary expectations. Henry III ruled for 56 years, transforming England from a war-torn island into one of Europe's most prosperous and stable kingdoms. His architectural patronage, legal innovations, and constitutional developments created institutional foundations that would endure for centuries. Richard of Cornwall became the wealthiest private individual in Christendom while pursuing imperial ambitions that, though ultimately unsuccessful, demonstrated English capacity for continental leadership. His commercial innovations and financial techniques influenced economic development across Western Europe. The daughters achieved diplomatic successes that military conquest had failed to secure. Joan's marriage pacified Scotland for a generation. Isabella's imperial alliance elevated English prestige to unprecedented heights. Eleanor's constitutional theories provided intellectual foundations for parliamentary government. Even the illegitimate children contributed to dynastic rehabilitation. Joan's Welsh marriage created lasting peace on England's western borders. Richard's military service helped preserve the monarchy during its most vulnerable period. Their careers demonstrated that royal blood, even illegitimate, could serve constructive political purposes when properly directed. The transformation these achievements represented becomes clear when comparing the family's position in 1216 with its status in 1272. John's death left a dynasty on the verge of extinction, with enemies controlling most of England and alternatives to Plantagenet rule readily available. Henry's death passed to Edward I a secure throne, a prosperous kingdom, and international respect that would support English expansion across the British Isles and into continental Europe. This rehabilitation required the children to consciously reject their father's methods while preserving his essential objectives. Where John had relied on intimidation and arbitrary power, they developed consensual governance and constitutional procedure. Where John had antagonized the church through jurisdictional disputes, they demonstrated ostentatious piety and generous patronage. Where John had alienated the nobility through financial extortion, they created mutually beneficial relationships based on shared interests. Yet the children also inherited their father's fundamental strengths: political intelligence, strategic thinking, and determined pursuit of dynastic interests. Henry's 56-year reign required the same stubborn persistence that had characterized John's resistance to baronial opposition. Richard's commercial success reflected the same innovative thinking that had marked John's administrative reforms. Eleanor's constitutional theories demonstrated the same willingness to challenge established authority that had defined John's conflicts with papal power. The family's collective legacy shaped English political development for generations. Henry's architectural patronage established Westminster as the ceremonial center of English government. His legal innovations strengthened royal courts while respecting baronial rights. His constitutional compromises after the Barons' Wars created precedents for parliamentary participation in royal governance. Richard's financial techniques influenced commercial development throughout Europe. His crusading diplomacy demonstrated that English resources could achieve international objectives through negotiation rather than conquest. His imperial career, though unsuccessful, proved that English nobles could compete for the highest honors in European politics. The daughters' diplomatic marriages created lasting changes in international relations. Joan's Scottish alliance began the process of peaceful unification that would eventually unite the British Isles under a single crown. Isabella's imperial connection elevated English prestige while introducing continental cultural influences. Eleanor's constitutional activism provided intellectual foundations for limitations on royal power. Even the bastards left lasting legacies. Joan's Welsh marriage created precedents for diplomatic resolution of ethnic conflicts. Richard's military career demonstrated royal bastards could serve legitimate dynastic interests without threatening succession stability. Their examples influenced future royal policies toward illegitimate offspring. As the 13th century drew to a close, the children of King John could claim to have accomplished the seemingly impossible task of rehabilitating the Angevin dynasty while transforming it into something entirely new. The peripatetic continental empire John had inherited from his predecessors had become an insular kingdom with settled institutions and constitutional government. The arbitrary personal rule that had characterized Angevin monarchy had evolved into a system balancing royal authority with parliamentary consent and legal procedure. Edward I inherited not merely a crown, but a political system that would prove adaptable enough to survive centuries of constitutional development while remaining recognizably English in character. The foundations he built upon were largely the work of his father and uncles, who had transformed their father's catastrophic failures into the materials for lasting success. In Westminster Abbey, Henry III's magnificent Gothic reconstruction provided a fitting memorial to this transformation. The building that rose from the rubble of Anglo-Saxon foundations symbolized the broader renewal the Plantagenet dynasty had undergone through the efforts of John's remarkable children. Their collective achievement was to prove that even the most damaged royal inheritance could be restored through intelligence, determination, and willingness to learn from previous failures. With their deaths in the 1270s, the last generation to remember John's catastrophic reign passed into history. But the institutions they had created, the precedents they had established, and the constitutional principles they had developed would shape English political development until the present day. The children who had inherited chaos bequeathed their successors a kingdom,